no, not to say noon, but to say midday. And the marvelous thing about word search is now you can check all these things to see if you've made a mistake. The other one was, there were just a number of them, and sometimes it was almost impossible to give the time because you couldn't say it was 3 o'clock. So it was things like that were very I had to work around it in order to avoid anachronisms. So that's how I approached it. And then I'm not just imagining, I'm imagining towards a greater project, which is to show the tropes of the Dharma at work on these characters, or their search for it, and also the kind of ways that they're trapped in the 3 poisons of greed, hatred, and delusion. So it's not just there, it's there to kind of enhance this greater project of trying to combine Buddhist narrative tropes with Western realism. So that's how I would approach it.
Thank you for that, Robin.
Right. How do you, I do nonfiction, I research history, but I think what helps me, of course, that I've chosen topics which are so exciting, they are dramatic, but when I start out, I don't know anything about it. I just know the broad outline. Let me just pick one book, which most of you know, Victoria and Abdul. All I knew when I started out was that he had cooked a curry for Queen Victoria, and she'd loved it. So, and then, the journey begins, and you start recreating the story from archives. So I read the letters, I read her Hindustani journals, which is, something I didn't know was that I knew she'd learnt a few phrases of Urdu. This is Queen Victoria. But I knew that in Windsor Castle they have these journals because she kept a diary, so I asked to see them. And I was expecting a phrase book with, some one word or two. The archivist wheeled in a trolley with 13 volumes. So I was there for a long time, but it just brought it alive. I could enter this bubble because it's just the 2 of them. And they're just talking about things like Queen Victoria saying, oh, Abdul's cat has had kittens and I'm going to see them. This is the Empress of India and she's going to go to Abdul's house to see the kittens. So, these little things just came out. And then, of course, I'm a journalist, so you have to see the whole thing. I had to see what the others are saying about him, all the gossip in the court. So I read the letters of the household, the ladies in waiting, her personal physician. And of course, they all hated him. So, to use a word, they are really bitchy about him. And so I know there is such a lot of hate for this man. So it all comes alive through the letters, the journals, the diaries. And then, of course, there's the newspaper reports. So as a journalist myself, I have to see what the press are reporting. And they describe. So their gossip columns have things like the Brown, John Brown is what they call him. And John Brown was a gilly who, had worked, had a relation with Queen Victoria before Abdul. So everything sort of fell into place. And then the Times give a description of this man, 6 foot tall, with a soft voice. I've seen his photos, and I can recreate that. So I think it's quite easy then, when you have all this material, to bring it to life. And vivid, thank goodness they kept these detailed diaries and journals, because there is an account of a strike in the book, where the household strike against Abdul. And it is described vividly, how this lady walks up to Queen Victoria and says that if you take Abdul to the south of France, we will all go on strike. This is the household. And what does Queen Victoria do? When she tells her, she just throws everything on her desk onto the floor, clatter of diaries, journals, photo frames, pens. And of course, the lady who said it, Mrs. Phipps, she goes running, she's in tears. Nobody goes on strike, everybody goes to the south of France. And Abdul, of course, is there, mentioned in the Gazette. And it's just such a vividly described scene in his journal that I just replicate that. And it's sourced, it's all heavily sourced. There's nothing created, but it's there. So that's how I sort of build it up.
Christian. Christopher.
Well, first of all, thank you for being here, and thank you for coming today, this morning, I guess. But I'm also very happy to be here because I came here last year for the first time and I've had a few events and I was very excited to be able to return back thanks to the Ceylon Lit Fest, but also to the Goethe Institute. Referring to your question, I mean, I came across the story many years ago. It's a true story about 3 Bavarian brothers and scientists who were employed by the East India Company, who traveled all over South Asia, also to Ceylon back then, and High Asia, and doing lots of research for the East India Company and supported by Alexander von Humboldt, but then also only 2 of them returned. There were some tragic events involved. And they did all kinds of research, but also kinds of lots of like mischief, you can imagine, you know, like white scientists traveling back at that time. And I had never heard of the story in Germany. It was one of the biggest expeditions of the whole century. It was like enormously funded and they brought back like 40,000 objects and it was a really big thing. And I always felt like, okay, it sounds like an exciting story, but I don't know how to tell it because it's like this historical story, but I cannot tell that story like through the perspective of these brothers. Like, oh, you know, they're traveling to this other part of the world, looking through the magnifying glass and looking at things and saying, oh, they're all very strange and exotic. So for a long time I struggled with how to actually approach it until I kind of found my protagonist, who is a translator who travels with them, who's an orphan boy from Bombay, and he kind of turns the whole thing around and he looks at these scientists and he's analyzing them throughout the journey and he's turning them into objects and he's questioning a lot of things that they're doing. And it was very helpful when I was preparing to write the book. I mean, I felt like later I only realized I had 3 ways of research. The one was the obvious one. You read about that time, and there's quite a lot written about that time, mid-19th century. Second of all, more interesting even so, was to read texts by the brothers. Unfortunately, they were not really great writers, so there's like thousands of pages where they, sometimes for 50 pages, they just describe the rain in a small town in South India. So you're like, okay. But still, you know, like you find there are a lot of treasures in there. But the third kind of research was the most important one, I realized only then, and it was a research I had done for quite a while without knowing, which was just living in India for a long time, because I'm married to a writer from Delhi, and so the last 12 years were basically the research to even be able to approach this book, because otherwise I would have felt kind of risky for me to write that story.
I'm going to ask you to read a passage, but before you do that, what actually drew you to this story? Because it really is little known. I mean, it was a fascinating expedition and it went on for several years through the length and breadth of India, but very few people actually know. Sorry, can you hear me now? Yeah. So what I was saying is that it's a little known historical event, what Christopher has written about. And, you know, yet it went on for several years. These brothers traveled the length and breadth of India. What drew you particularly to this?
Well, the obvious answer would be, like, I guess, you know, I'm this guy from Bavaria who got married to someone from India and who now happened to be spending a lot of time here. And so, like, you come across a story where one of the biggest expeditions of the century were these Bavarian guys who came to India. So, like, I felt a certain, like, oh, yeah, that's interesting. But I was more astonished by the fact that nobody knew about it. And I think more in the context that, okay, you don't know the story, but I think even more so I realized that in Germany, at least, we are very much behind on the whole colonial narrative. Like even nowadays, you look at it, you realize that, I mean, like there's several reasons for it. And like on one hand, people say, well, we had to deal with other things historically first. You know what I'm talking about. So we had to like kind of work our way backwards. And so there was like, you know, GDR and Nazis, and then you only come across about on the colonial aspects, and it was a shorter colonial time we had, and so people were like, oh, it's not so important. I mean, it turns out it was extremely important, especially on the scientific front, because what I found most interesting about this was that, well, we often talk about colonialism on the level of like, you know, like there's this government exploiting, or this country exploiting this other country, or that culture doing this, but what I found so interesting here was that the Germans didn't have many relations to South Asia or with South Asia, but the scientists who were involved, they were kind of at the forefront. They were like the first ones to go into many territories, and you know, all the information they would gather in all kinds of fields, because it was a very holistic scientific time still. They would write about like who is governing this, like what kind of plants grow there, how's the rain, how is the military, who's going to be the successor of this Maharaja. So they write about everything and analyze everything. They're kind of the Google of their times. And then they bring all that knowledge back, and guess who they're delivering it to? The East India Company. So the East India Company is like, oh great, now we have all the knowledge, and makes it all the way easier, you know, to exploit the culture on so many levels. And interestingly, until today, we have this image of the 19th century, in Germany at least, of the poets, the thinkers, and the scientists, and all these adventures. So it's like very high culture. But the problem is like these guys, also in terms of racial profiling, they supported many of these ideas that turned out to be very wrong and very problematic later on. And so I think it's really time to talk about this, but I also, of course, was fascinated just by how their findings and the perspective they had to things, because sometimes they are very colonial and still kind of haven't changed that much till today. But on the other hand, you're like, in their writings, you find a lot of examples where they would arrive in Bombay and start criticizing how the English would treat the natives, how they call them, and would say like, oh, you know, they really look down on them. I don't think it's a good thing. And you realize, you know, what we call today something like racism, for example, it existed back then. Maybe they didn't brand it this way, but there was something like that, and people were aware of it. They just didn't care that much, because they felt scientifically it's fine. Because anyway, certain people are smarter than others.
Okay. Christopher, may I invite you to read a passage from Museum of the World?
Well, I guess I should add that, having said all that, with all the background and all the intellectual stuff, I still had a lot of fun writing this book. It was so much fun to take apart these scientists, and Bartholomew was a great help doing that. So he's the narrator, and he is leading you through this novel. And I'm just going to read you the first 1.5 pages, so you get an idea how he thinks and how he sounds. And the first chapter is called Remarkable Object Number 1, the Museum of the World. Because every chapter in this book is not a chapter, it's an object. That's because Bartholomew considers himself a scientist. My name is Bartholomew. I am at least 12 years old, and today, on 20th October 1854, I have founded India's first museum. I call it the Museum of the World. Smita-Ben says it should be called the Museum of Wretchedness. But what does a cook from Gujarat really know about such things? I do not want to write anything bad about her, even if she cannot read, but time and again she surprises me with how little she understands in more than one regard. After over 10 years in Bombay, she can barely speak a word of Marathi or Hindi. Without my help, no one in the glass house would know what she has cooked for us. And Smita-Ben would not be able to tell the sabziwala what vegetable she needs. When he arrives with his cart in front of our gate early in the morning, she has long been up and about, cleaning one of the many windows that give St. Helena its sobriquet. Smita-Ben is always the first to get up, and I am not sure whether she sleeps at all. In the evenings, when the lights are put out in the dormitories, we can hear her downstairs in the kitchen, scrubbing the pots and chasing the cockroaches. She does not have a family, at any rate, not a real one. All the orphans call her Masi. Her hair is white, not grey like that of other Masis, but white like the dough of the Portuguese bao that she sometimes bakes for us. Smita-Ben knows a thing or two about taste. I prefer her salty sweet handvo to all of Bombay's dishes. Unfortunately, her other senses are not as well developed. She has spent so much of her life looking at ordinary things that she does not see what is remarkable. How silly of me not to have thought of that. Smita-Ben's reaction to India's first museum matched her rustic nature. She gave me a smack on the back of my head, which did not hurt, and disappeared again into her territory, the kitchen. I went outside to show Devinder the museum. Devinder is our gardener. He comes from Punjab. Although he is not a Sikh, he allows his hair to grow all over, he once whispered to me. He claims that to cut one's hair or indeed to shave means to lack in any masculinity whatsoever. I claim that Devinder is too lazy and too poor to visit a barber. The first is clearly indicated by the condition of the plants all around the glass house. The palms bend as if they were bowing down to the sun. The grass has crept back into the earth, and the mogra flowers wither away before they have fully blossomed. Still, Father Fuchs does not have the heart to dismiss Devinder. That is how I know that Devinder is poor, because Father Fuchs is overly friendly to everyone he considers poor. He must be one of the friendliest people in Bombay. Thank you.
Thank you, Christopher.